Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Michael Burrows and I serve as director of the KIE Institute of Ethics. And on behalf of the Institute, thank you for joining us tonight for this very special KIE Institute of Ethics lecture featuring Dr. Michele Moody Adams. I want to begin by thanking our supporting sponsors who make this program possible: the KIE family, Valley Strong Credit Union, Kaiser Permanente, and Adventist Health Bakersfield. I also want to thank our CSUB IT team that has helped us with the technology for tonight's event. So a few notes on the procedure for tonight's talk. Dr. Moody Adams will deliver her talk titled Monuments and the Obligations of Collective Memory. And following that, I will moderate a Q&A session with all of you. So for your questions, you can submit those via the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can open that up and submit questions at any time. So you don't need to wait till the end of the talk. If something strikes you of interest, go ahead and enter the question and it'll be in the queue there for me to get to at the end of the talk. And I'll do my best to get to as many of your questions for Dr. Moody Adams as possible. And with that, I'm honored to introduce our guest. So Dr. Michele Moody Adams is Joseph Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University, where she also served as Dean of Columbia College and Vice President for Undergraduate Education. Dr. Moody Adams has published on equality and social justice, moral psychology and virtues, and the philosophical implications of gender and race. Her current work includes articles on academic freedom, equal educational opportunity, and democratic disagreement. Her next book, coming out in late 2021, is entitled Making Space for Justice, Social Movements, Collective Imagination, and Political Hope. She has been a British Marshall Scholar, an NEH Fellow, and is a lifetime honorary fellow of Somerville College in Oxford. So Dr. Moody Adams, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and good evening to everyone. I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas about monuments and memory with you. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got what I hope are some interesting visuals to accompany the talk. So we're going to start with this picture of a monument that's now in the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond. A beautiful bronze and marble sculpture of a young girl named Barbara Johns, who at 16 years old actually conducted a walkout from a high school that she argued rightly was underserved and under-resourced, and she wanted to protest the racial segregation that made that happen. So the title of my talk today is Monuments and the Obligations of Collective Memory. So I'm going to start by asking how societies can preserve healthy collective identities. And I want to argue that societies, like individuals, often need a sense of a relatively stable identity through time. This means that they must be able to do two things. First, to recognize continuity between the past and the present, but also to have hope or promote hope for constructive connections between the present and their visions for the future. And again, I think this is very much like what individuals need to do at some point in their lives. But then the question is, how do societies establish this kind of continuity through time? I'm making the argument this evening that civic art, and I include architecture, of remembrance can be an important part of the effort. And I use the phrase civic art of remembrance. I'll use it a lot this evening during the talk to cover these kinds of things. First of all, material expressions of collective memory, monuments, memorials, commemorative museums, historic battlefields, and civic landscapes. But also sometimes it involves oratory, written rhetoric and poetry. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, for instance, for me is a kind of civic art of remembrance. And even some instances of the performing arts, especially music. Later in the talk, I'll actually refer to what I think of as one of the most important examples of this very kind of performing art. But I also think we need to preface some of the debate or the discussion with a knowledge that there's a debate about terminology here. The words memorial and monument both have Latin roots. The Latin for memorial comes from memory, memoria, and from monument comes from monere, to remind. But there is a general assumption, and it's represented in the quote I'm going to give you here from Arthur Danto, great philosopher of art, actually taught at Columbia for many years. It's often thought that these two kinds of art of remembrance do very different things. And here's Danto's version of that claim. He says, we erect monuments so that we shall always remember, and build memorials so that we shall never forget. Thus we have the Washington Monument, but the Lincoln Memorial. Monuments commemorate the memorable and embody the myths of beginnings. Memorials, he says, ritualize remembrance and mark the reality of ends. It's a very neat and nice dichotomy he's drawing there. So here are some examples. His Washington Monument example, he says, well, it's vertical and it's a celebration almost like fireworks. But the Lincoln Memorial, and we'll have pictures of each of these later in the talk, even if it's up on a rise in Washington, D.C. on the Mall, he says it presses down and it's a meditation in stone. Now, I, for a while, believed that, and then I started myself thinking a lot more about both kinds of art of remembrance. I think the story is more complicated, and I hope you'll think so too. So memorials do always mark endings, and they do ritualize remembrance. This is the Thiepval Memorial in France to the missing of the Somme. And this was a battle that took place essentially over about 3 years, the worst of it being in 1916. It was a combination of French and English soldiers fighting against the German front, and mostly, as I said, in 1916. 72,900 people died. All their names are in fact engraved on this incredible memorial. And one of the reasons this is such an important one to cite is that later this ends up influencing Maya Lin, who's the architect of the Vietnam Memorial, where they, of course, list all 58,000 names of the people who died fighting in Vietnam. But some memorials also actually celebrate forward-looking values. So here's the King Memorial in DC. And so here's the familiar gigantic image of King. But here on one of the many walls, there are something like 16 quotations from his writings over the years. And some of them are forward-looking. This one is from his Nobel Peace Prize speech in 1964. I'll just read it. I have the audacity, he says, to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. So I think of that as not just about commemorating endings, but also about looking forward. Then there's complexity in the way you should think about monuments. They often celebrate, of course, myths of beginnings. You'll see in a moment one that I think is important here, but they may also commemorate past achievements. And occasionally, I'll show you in about 2 slides from now, sometimes they're more focused actually on endings than beginnings. Here is the Washington Monument, dedicated in 1886. Some of you will know it has all these wonderful fives in the number. It's 555 feet tall. It's 5,125 inches in width, at the base, et cetera, 100,000 tons in weight. And of course, it does celebrate the beginning of the American, political experiment, but it's also celebrating the ending of Washington's life and his achievements. And you'll see, as I said in a moment, how some monuments focus more on endings than beginnings. But finally, thinking about monuments, some of the things we call monuments are actually products of nature, not human construction. One of my most favorite places in the entire world, Monument Valley, Navajo Tribal Park, these beautiful towering sandstone buttes. It's in Arizona. Some of them are 400 feet tall. Some of them are as high as 1,000. That's taller, by almost 2 times taller than the Washington Monument. And we call these things monuments, not for what they celebrate, but because they display the expanse and magnificence of nature. This is the idea of what's monumental in size. But of course, as I've said already, we'll see that some humanly constructed monuments can actually be quite small. And here is an example that might well be familiar to some people in the audience. I've never been to this monument. I'm hoping I get a chance to go sometime. This is the Cesar Chavez National Monument, a 116-acre site that is 32 miles, as I understand it, from Bakersfield. It has his home and his office and the actual legal aid offices and so forth that he used. The idea behind collective memory being so important is that these monuments that, again, here's a very small one, these commemorate, for instance, notable events or eras. They celebrate notable people. They affirm sometimes shared values, and they can express shared sentiments like a sense of loss or a willingness to, a readiness to acknowledge suffering and to try to think about healing. So this is why collective memory matters, actually, in the material sense. I also want to remind people that communities of memory are not only nations. Here is a very beautiful, I think, wonderfully thought out remembrance of the 35 Syracuse University students who were killed in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. And it's a reminder that all kinds of communities may use the art of remembrance to try to create continuity between past and present, and to provide hope for constructive connections between the present and the future. And Syracuse does another wonderful thing. They also every year award 35 what they call Remembrance Scholarships to students who have distinguished themselves both with academic work, service to the community, and as citizens. So it's a combination of remembrance projects. But I want to stress that collective imaginings matter. And I think of these monuments as collective expressions of our imagining, because imagination, in a way we don't always focus on in some political philosophy and some moral thought, it plays a critical role in human communities. It helps to constitute community. It shapes collective identities, and it helps sometimes anyway to promote solidarity. And I think the civic art of remembrance is a very important embodiment of this role that imagination plays in communities. It helps to determine how the past shapes the present, and it helps sometimes in bad ways, sometimes in good, to set the boundaries within which we can imagine the future. And those of you who are interested in political philosophy will want to know that the political philosopher Charles Taylor has a wonderful book, something like 1995 or something like that, called Modern Social Imaginaries, in which he tries to help us understand how political philosophy ought to build on this argument that comes from Benedict Anderson, who's actually himself an anthropologist. But this book has been terribly influential and has been republished with new editions and introductions and so forth. The idea, I think, is very central to understanding why monuments matter so much. So to return to the main line of the argument, I'm claiming that there's certain obligations we have to meet, both when we create as well as try to preserve or decide whether to preserve particular instances of the art of remembrance. Some of those obligations are prudential, by which I mean obligations of rational prudence. If you are rational, what would you want to do or happen? I'm arguing that the civic art of remembrance is governed by such obligations because any complex political society has a prudential obligation to promote political stability by aiding our sense of continuity over time. And I go on to claim that wherever it's feasible, both materially and especially economically, so if communities aren't choosing between whether to feed their people or build a monument, they should, if they don't have to make that choice, I think monuments are a very good use of public energy and resources. This obligation can and should be met, at least in part, by appropriate civic art of remembrance. And it should be stressed that in democracies, very often the beginnings of some instance of the art of remembrance actually come from private citizens and donations, but then the public, the government, the institutions have to decide whether to make space for it. So it is both a public and a private project usually together. And sometimes, though possibly not always, there can also be a moral obligation to produce civic art that promotes certain central values of political morality. And I'm going to say that this is especially important, this last point, when you think about the role that art of remembrance plays in democracies. So I'm making the claim that civic art of remembrance is often governed by moral obligations. But what are those obligations? I'm actually going to focus only on democracy, but you could also think about them in other political contexts. This focus here is on democratic political institutions. So I'm claiming that in a democracy that's ideally governed by commitments to liberty, equality, and fraternity, some of you will find that last value provocative for me to have listed, but liberty, equality, and fraternity. Civic art of remembrance is governed by two additional principles that generate moral obligations. And what are those principles? I believe they are as follows. First, create only those monuments and memorials that preserve memory without limiting our ability to constructively reimagine society. And I'm thinking here usually in the interest of justice, right? Even the best society can go awry. And sometimes we've got to recalibrate, rethink, restructure, and reform. But we also have a worry when we inherit a built environment, public square shaped by statues that some earlier generation produced. We have a different set of obligations that come out of the question of what we should preserve and what we should not preserve. And I argue that we should preserve only, and when feasible, all those monuments and memorials that embody and promote fundamental democratic values. And again, I stress, for me, they are liberty, equality, and fraternity. So what does this actually mean? But also, why am I so confident that this is an obligation? I'm going to answer those two questions. What does it actually mean? And why am I confident that there is such an obligation in the remaining part of the talk? So I start with the idea that all civic art has powerful symbolic content. It's usually representational, and sometimes it will represent something actually with a figure or a sculpture of some kind, but sometimes it's also telling a story. In this case, this is the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. I've never seen this in person. I was sort of thinking about monuments I hadn't seen when I was preparing to talk to you this evening, and I felt I should educate myself on where I want to go over time. Some of you will know that in 1963, part of the civil rights movement's campaign took place in Birmingham, Alabama, where there was very, very broad segregation, and kind of crushingly so in many parts of Birmingham life. And they even sent out children as part of the campaign to protest against it. And there are all these images in the media. Some of them went international, they went global, of snarling dogs that were unleashed against nonviolent protesters, children being sprayed by high pressure hoses. And this really set the world on fire. It actually brought so much shame to America that it finally had people in Washington actually taking the movement seriously. And I want to say that this actually is not so different from what monuments and memorials often do, which is they virtually always tell a story. And when you realize that they're telling a story of some kind, I think there's 7 questions that you can and should ask to see whether they're telling the story in a way that affirms those values I've mentioned, liberty, equality, and fraternity, and does it promote them in a way that celebrates the values that democracies care about? The first question, is the story that it tells true or false? Second question, if that story is central to a larger narrative, right, that might be composed of several stories, is the narrative itself true or false? Does the story and the narrative, does it strengthen a myth or a legend that's constructive or dangerous, right? We know that, some of the images that surround the founding, for instance, of a nation, in particular the US, they are around a lot of myths, the founding fathers, et cetera, et cetera. Are those myths and legends that are embodied symbolically in certain monuments? Are they constructive or are they dangerous? Who rather does the monument or memorial celebrate, and who does it denigrate? What roles does the story define as important, and which ones does it ignore? This is influenced by the way that the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre talks about how narratives shape people's lives. You're born into the world, you're governed before you even know it by a bunch of stories that are told about people like you. They mark out these roles. You need to figure out what they are, but sometimes you have to fight against them because they may be stories that constrain or confine you. Do monuments do that? And if they do, what should we do about it? And then finally, what conduct, what kinds of actions, what sort of behavior does the story implicitly recommend or condemn? And I don't know, when I look at this image of those snarling dogs, and there's something about that little boy in that very formal attire walking through, I just think that this little kid being endangered by adults who don't want to give him equal access to opportunity. That's interesting. To me, that recommends this monument is try to do something about it. But not every story is like that. And the story that I won't spend too much time on this, but everyone will have it on their minds. The story that shapes Confederate monuments, symbols, flags, etc., is a story of a very distinctive kind. So the story initially gets its most sustained expression in a work by an author named Edwin Pollard called The Lost Cause, a quote unquote new Southern history of the war, the Confederates. That story gets embodied in statues. This is the one that everybody fought over, right? In Charlottesville, the white supremacists who marched and said they weren't going to be replaced by this and that person, particular groups they wished to denigrate with their story. And then here is an example of one of the many monuments erected in that period from about 1915 to 1920, as you can see, 1924, well after the Civil War had ended. And then you wonder what's going on. The narrative that they were representing and the stories they were telling, according to the best and most reflective historian named David Blight, for instance, in Race and Reunion, Civil War Memory and Civil War History and the Burden of Memory. They argued that this falsified Civil War history, that it denied the evils of slavery, and that it in effect justified white supremacist violence. And my argument, if I were to sustain, I have other papers, lectures in which I talk more fully about this, is that it's very hard to understand how you can extract these monuments and symbols and their content symbolically from this narrative, given that at every major juncture in American history where it comes up, these monuments show that they are focal points for memory and celebration of white supremacist violence. I just find it very hard. There's the concept of, plausible deniability. My argument is always there's no deniability here. This story is just too weighty in burdening these monuments, and I want to resist it. But here's a happier story of the same era, a monument that has now become widely, and I think rightly celebrated as representing an incredible truth about the Civil War. This is the memorial to Robert Shaw and the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts, the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, commissioned in 1883, dedicated 1897. In a moment, I'll say something about that date. The 54th Regiment was the first all African-American regiment shortly after Emancipation was completed to fight in the Union cause. They were the first of about 180,000 African-American soldiers. And the odd thing about this whole effort to memorialize this is that the battle that this regiment fought in was a battle that they did not win. And they didn't just win it, but the colonel was killed, Colonel Shaw, several members of the regiment, the Black Regiment, were killed, but it was thought of as this extraordinary, emblematic story of what it meant for African Americans to fight for their own freedom, but for them to fight for their freedom next to a white commander and white officers who celebrated their efforts. And some of you will, if you've seen the movie Glory, you will know that is the 1989 film Glory that actually helped bring this memorial back into prominence. One problem It's dedicated in 1897. The year before that, in 1896, was the decision, often called the National Decision Against Equality. That's the phrase from the historian C. Van Woodward, the National Decision Against Equality. And so this memorial at the time ended up not having the effect it probably could have. But I want to spend just a few minutes telling you why I think it is a very different kind of narrative, and that it actually comes closer to meeting the goals of the moral obligations of collective memory embodied in civic art than anything we've seen so far. So here's a detailed view of the colonel. He was a white resident of the Boston area, not extremely well-to-do, but sort of well off, and family a little bit shocked initially that he wanted to command this Black regiment, but he was quite an extraordinary fellow himself. Equally extraordinary, though, let's go back for a moment to the monument itself, is that he's depicted here not as many Civil War monuments would have, not the lone officer on his horse towering above everybody else, but he's depicted as being in the middle of his regiment. He's on the horse, but he's in the midst of this regiment. He's part of this collective that's sharing in this sacrifice and suffering. And in fact, there's an angel of death here. It's meant to express rather the shared sacrifice. So that's part of what's so extraordinary about it. He's defying St. Gaudens, many of the conventions of Civil War monuments. But one of the things I like most, even though the story of how these depictions came to be is complicated, St. Gaudens went out of his way to get representations in the 19th century, post-Civil War, of African-American men that actually made them look fully realized and human. They look like people. They look people with pride and ambition, even though they're about to walk to some of them to their death. And it turns out that St. Gaudens did two things that no other memorial in this time did. He portrays the soldiers as actually fighting in the military, in the army. Only two other monuments from this era do that. And he has them in their uniforms. And I think it's just an extraordinary thing. We will come back to this monument at the end. It will be the thing I conclude with, because I think it is such an inspiration in that way. Now, some of you who know the story will know that St. Gaudens was an imperfect guy. He hired models to pose for him, and he sculpted these gorgeous, some of them are on display various museums around America, little small figures where he's trying to practice. In his notes while he's sculpting them, he's saying the most derogatory things. He's citing the standard racial epithets of the day. So I think even he was struggling with trying to fight the conventions, both of representation and even of activity in political life. But he managed to get past that racism enough to give us a monument with much to recommend it. And I'll say a few more things about it at the end of my talk. But now I want to turn, given where I moved from the contrast from the Confederate monuments and with the St. Gaudens monument of the 54th Regiment and Colonel Shaw, we have to ask, as part of the moral obligations of particularly the monuments that we're thinking about creating. So there's what we preserve, but there's what we create. Can the art of remembrance ever be part of a moral reckoning with the past? Some countries have done terrible things. You can think, obviously, Germany. I mean, you can think America. You can think South Africa. Is it possible for this kind of project, this public project of remembrance, to be part of coming to terms with, apologizing for, et cetera, a past? And I think there are two questions you have to ask to see if is it possible for a particular monument to be part of this activity? First, does it support a collective identity that doesn't suppress human dignity or disregard human suffering? But second, does it reflect openness to the possibility of moral repair when our society in particular caused undeserved suffering? I actually think both questions can be answered in the affirmative. So I think art of remembrance can be part of a moral and an important part of moral reckoning. Here's one example. This is the Emmett Till, or part of the Emmett Till Memory Project in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. In 1955, some of you will know, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, that's my hometown actually, named Emmett Till, went down to visit family. He didn't know the ways of the South. His mother cautioned him. It's not clear that he did anything that he deserved to be harmed for, but he allegedly whistled at a local white woman. This was too much for some locals there, and he was abducted at night, tortured, murdered, and his body thrown into the river. And one of the interesting things about this, there are other efforts in other parts of Mississippi, but this is part of a large project. They've tried to preserve it. They've created a museum. They tell the story, not just of Emmett Till, but of the civil rights movement, both before and after. And there's actually an apology that preceded this project. I think it came in something like 2007 to the family, that I think is part of a genuine effort and a really valuable effort to show the rest of us how civic art of remembrance can be part of a moral reckoning with the past. I think this is actually an even more famous and in some ways more powerful attempt at that. This is in Berlin in Germany. It is the Berlin Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. It consists of something like 3,100 concrete blocks. They call them stelae. They are vertical, different heights, situated in different levels through the field of concrete blocks. It's called a field of concrete pillars. The sculptor slash, actually the artist slash architect was an architect named Peter Eisenmann. It's an extraordinary effort. It is very controversial because it's not representational. And it initially didn't have any words around it to tell people why it mattered. So he agreed, Eisenmann did, to have a kind of lower underground project that did depict in more detail the history. But I actually think this is one that I have visited, and I actually had the privilege of getting to know just a little bit Peter Eisenmann in a role I played at Cornell University. This is one I actually think really works. If you walk down in the middle of it, you get lost, you get disoriented, you feel afraid. Obviously, it's not like being in a concentration camp, and it's not like being hunted down by people who want to kill you, but it gives you just a little bit of the feeling of what it would be like to be so unmoored from everything you took to be for granted as part of your home. And I think that's what he was trying to get at. And I think it's a powerful attempt at this civic art coming in service of moral reckoning with the past. Another one, a little more controversial for some people I know, but for me, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, here I'm giving you only one part of it. You know, there are two other parts. The soldiers that were sculptured by Frederick Hart, and then there's a third part that shows or depicts a sculpture of some of the women who were nurses in Vietnam, many of whom also died. This was the one that I promised would be echoing the Tiepval Memorial, where here all 58,000, it's a little bit more now, names of all the servicemen who died in the war engraved. And that's my finger with the type. I took the picture myself. My husband's there standing reflected in the background. I didn't have a relative, even though I had relatives who fought in other wars. I didn't have a close one who fought in Vietnam. So someone that I worked with gave me the name of someone she knew. So I could trace it and find it. You go and you look in the book and you find it. I believe for all of its imperfections, and many people say it should have been more open about the moral challenges of the war. Maybe it should have represented the deaths of the Vietnamese themselves. Those are challenges people raise. But this got people talking. It got people not blaming the soldiers who were drafted, who went. I think it is one effort, powerful effort, at a kind of reckoning, if incomplete, but a reckoning with a morally problematic past. So let me now turn to a couple of the questions that I think are worth investigating before I stop my lecture. One of them is the very large question that's probably percolating in your brain if you were even alive in 2020. You didn't even have to be alive in America because the movement against monuments spread globally. There's something like 15 cities across the world where it spread. What do we do when existing art of remembrance seems to constrain efforts to make space for justice? So here is the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond, and it's with reason that I use that other memorial at the start of the young woman who was protesting segregation in Richmond. I use that for a reason. What do? Do you destroy it? Do you move it to a different kind of space? Do you try to reframe it and recontextualize it? We know a lot of what happened in 2020 and other times actually were destroyed, but there have been places where moving monuments to a different space was thought to be a better option. So one example, the Memento Park in Budapest, Hungary, another place I've never been, but hope I can. I went to Budapest many, many years ago before this must have been a site worth seeing. This is a place, you'll see in a moment, I'll use a phrase. This is a quote from a CNN story that I watched online about the Memento Park. It's called sometimes a place where communist statues go to die. It's an open air museum in Budapest where monumental statues and plaques from Hungary's communist period, 1949 to 1989, have been moved. There are statues of Lenin and Marx and so forth that are there. And people think this is a way of not honoring that era, but of also not ignoring that it happened and not denying people access to memory of it. That's one example of the move it to a different place model. Here is one, and I should tell you, I thought a lot about whether I could personally myself depict this, but it's really critical to have it here. Peter Eisenmann, I think I mentioned that I had an interaction with him in the 2000s, shall we say, at Cornell. He actually refused to design this. He didn't know how he could remember National Socialism, Nazism. That's what the NS stands for, National Socialism. He didn't know how he could remember without celebrating. Other people took up the task. It is built, it should be noted, on the site of what was once the actually main Nazi national headquarters in Munich. It has on the top floors, from my reading, a permanent exhibition that kind of talks about the history of the National Socialist movement, images, text, audio and video guides. The lower floors talk about the current moment. How has Munich and how has Germany in general tried to come to terms with its past? And it actually mentions the fact that there's still an awful lot of anti-Semitism and all kinds of other anti-ethnic, anti-racist prejudice that is frightening that people maybe need to see as connected to the Nazi movement itself. So that's the move it, but don't destroy it model. Here's a different model. I'm going to give you just a few examples here. The Lincoln Memorial. So it was dedicated in 1922 as essentially a part of a kind of national reconciliation, North and South in America, where the North was just excited that they would not mention Lincoln's role in emancipation. At the dedication, a Black man who was invited to speak, an educator from the South, was told that he could not read the speech he'd planned to read about Lincoln's role in emancipation. Lo and behold, 17 years later, 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let Marian Anderson sing in the Constitution Hall. So they have her give this concert in the grounds of the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people came, many more, hundreds of thousands heard it on the radio. It recontextualized, it reframed this memorial. And now people associate it basically with civil rights in a way that would not have been imaginable in 1922. Here's another example, different kind of thing, because it wasn't built as a monument to anything, but it's become such a thing. Robben Island Prison, I guess a little bit north, the island, Robben Island of Cape Town, South Africa. Nelson Mandela, among many other people, was held prisoner here for many years. It's now been, I'll use the very sort of common phrase. It's been repurposed, if you will, but reframed is better, as a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. I had a lovely encounter once with a student in one of my classes who told me about going to the grounds of the prison and picking up a rock and saying, Nelson Mandela might have helped chip this rock. One more example, and then we're kind of concluding our talk for the day. The Emancipation Memorial, the Freedmen's Memorial, this took a lot of heat this summer in 2020. And some people say rightly. Before you know why it took it rightly, or actually maybe you can see it. Here's Lincoln standing tall, and here is an African-American man, emancipated, on his knees, no shirt, no full clothing, Lincoln standing tall. The thing to know, it was funded entirely, almost entirely, by donations from former slaves and Civil War veterans. And the people who wanted to tear it down this summer sort of lost sight of that being at least a relevant fact. In the 1870s, during the dedication, in fact, Frederick Douglass actually wrote a letter to the editor of a DC newspaper in which he said, look, I think it's an admirable monument, it's here in Lincoln Park in DC, but it's a monument that is lacking. It does not represent the Negro, that was the word, erect, he says, and on his feet like a man. And he even said, look, there's room in the park for another monument. And he says, I throw out this suggestion that we maybe put something else in there. More recently, the historian David Blight over this 2020 summer actually said you should build some new parts to this memorial and you should put Frederick Douglass at the center of it. So I think we should remember we can recontextualize and reframe. I'm going to end with 3 objections. First, can statues really be as morally and politically weighty as my account has claimed? And my argument is going to be, you betcha. Here's Rhodes Must Fall, that movement in 2015 in Cape Town, South Africa. Here is the one of the protests against the Lee Memorial in Richmond. I love that, respect existence or expect resistance. And people say, oh, it's just political correctness. Those modern, they're just like, they're snowflakes. Well, were they snowflakes in 1776 when they pulled down the statue of George III of Bowling Green, aided, I should add, by some of George Washington's soldiers? They heard a reading of the Declaration of Independence, and they were fired up and they said, it's gotta go. Second objection, is it art or is it propaganda? Some of you will worry that I'm trying to turn art into propaganda. And I say to you what W.E.B. Du Bois said, all art is propaganda and ever must be. Despite the wailing of the purists, I add, George Orwell, all art is propaganda. On the other hand, not all propaganda is art. So if that's your worry about it, it's all propaganda. There's propaganda in service of good ends and propaganda in service of bad. But I want to conclude with a final objection. Some of you may say, okay, all that's fine and good, but are monuments and memorials maybe obsolete? Have they just lost their purpose in the modern era? And there are really 2 main versions of this objection. The first is that they're fundamentally anti-democratic. And there have been all kinds of versions of this over the years. Walt Whitman had one, Pericles in ancient Athens. In the 1980s, especially in Germany, people thought, stop building those tall things. Just, put a temporary thing out, let it go, some flowers, and you're done, and then you end, and then you commemorate something different. But my argument is that these monuments and memorials serve an important purpose, especially in democracies. They can communicate democratic virtues and serve as sources of democratic solidarity and stability. But then, there's a second objection, sorry about that. And that's that even if they aren't anti-democratic, do they just tie us too much to the past? So Lewis Mumford argued that monuments and memorials represent fixity and death, not growth and renewal that we ought to be thinking about if we care about human progress and so forth. But my argument is progress is important, and these monuments can sometimes be part of that. They can be meaningful ways of reconstituting a collective identity and they can be catalysts for moral accountability. You don't like the Vietnam Memorial, particularly the Berlin Memorial by Eisenmann, moral accountability and social hope. And I end with what for me is the best example of that. It's now just, so over the summer 2020, people who thought any memorial that had people from the Civil War in it was somehow a Confederate monument, they didn't know what they were doing. This monument is the first stop on the Black Heritage Trail in the Boston area for a reason. It depicts the true meaning of the Civil War, which was people fighting for equality and freedom and respect and dignity. The philosopher William James recognized this. He actually delivered one of the speeches at the dedication in 1897. I'm not sure I recommend that everybody has to read it. It's very long, and I've joked about this. It's a little long-winded, but he actually says some of the most marvelous things about its values imaginable, the true meaning of the Civil War. He called it a noble work of bronze, and frankly, I fully agree. And I thank you for your time. And I look forward to talking more with you, talking with you actually about the issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moody Adams, for a fantastic talk and fascinating lecture. So we have some time for questions now, and I do see several questions in the queue. So I'll get us started here. The first one is from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, should a memorial only be designed after a society has clearly accepted a version of what the story is or should be that it depicts?
Wow, that's a good question. In part because you do have to have some story embodied in it when you build it. But my theory builds on an idea defended by the sort of Dadaist artist Marcel Duchamp, surrealist, I should say, who made the claim that art is only partly the creation of the original artist. The interpretations of all the people who view it and debate it and argue about it also help to reshape and in effect help to create it. So we put our interpretations out. They help to give it a new meaning. They help actually to complete it. So we don't have to worry, I think, about the fact that we are encapsulating one version of the story because it's a focal point for memory. It's not exhaustive of memory. Whenever we try to remember something, we're always constructing a story, and we can reconstruct that story when we get better information, better understanding, and even better in the sense of a collective, better self-knowledge of what was happening at the time.
Thank you. This question comes from Karen, Dr. Moody Adams, and Karen asks, who in the community or which community should decide whether a monument is moved, destroyed, or reframed?
Oh, that is such a hard question. I think if you're going to have people deciding it, you need to have a committee that's composed of people from lots of different parts of the community where the monument is. I have one example actually right now. So I'm from Chicago. I live in Manhattan, but I'm from Chicago, and there is a committee just formed like 7 or 8 months ago that has a list of maybe 30 or 40 monuments that are being reviewed. Some of them might need to be moved for the Obama Presidential Library that's going up in a part of the city called Jackson Park. I will say the list is mostly pretty interesting, but they have on that list one of my favorite monuments actually in Jackson Park. It's a St. Gaudens statue of Columbia, one of the last vestiges of the World's Columbian exhibition. I don't think it's got any bad values. I don't think it disrespects or denigrates anybody. I'm hoping somebody on that committee can say, don't just assume because it's old and because it's big, that it has to be somehow intrinsically bad. You need to have arguments that bring in different vantage points from different constituents and different socioeconomic status, et cetera, in the community. But there's one monument there, Columbia. Oh, please don't take that. I feel like writing a letter and saying, can I be on the committee? So it needs to be a committee, and it needs to be composed of lots of different kinds of people.
Thank you. This question comes from Mark, and it's returning us to the discussion of Confederate monuments. And Mark asks, what do you think we should do about Confederate monuments and things like Stone Mountain? when they were likely put in place to show the Confederacy in a good light by groups such as the Daughters of the Confederacy?
Wow. I will say I have one attitude about the monuments that are intrinsically movable that doesn't just translate over into something like Stone Mountain, which is very, very problematic. You know, people have a right to want to put a group in good light, but you know, if they have a version of a story that then when we try to map it onto the story that the monument genuinely came out of, I'm not sure that their version of the story is rightly determinative of how we should react to it. But I don't know what to do with Stone Mountain. I mean, it is a lot like for some people, some Native people I know, Mount Rushmore has its own problematic status in this way. And I think this is a statue, there's a carving of Crazy Horse, I think that's not so far from, when something's been built into a natural, outcropping, I actually think it was already problematic. We already should have resisted that. So I don't know what to do about Stone Mountain. I wish we could cover it up, but I'm not sure that would do it. I think that should be for a committee to decide. I don't think that any one person, and it should be people who live in the community as well as perhaps some from without on that committee. I hope that's not too unsatisfactory an answer.
So, Dr. Moody, it seems like some of these questions that come up around monuments are tied to complexities with the moral legacy of individuals and events, which are complex and not uniform, right? So do you have kind of standards or principles that you use to think about, how we can constructively grapple with the complexity of people's moral legacies? An example that comes to mind for me is someone like just, Christopher Columbus, and the way what Christopher Columbus might mean to people in the Italian American community versus indigenous communities. Or a less dramatic example, but still a prominent one, someone like Jonas Salk, who has a tremendous impact through developing the polio vaccine, but did a lot of testing on orphan children and foster children who didn't have really any informed consent rights. So there's lots of people with complex moral legacies, i.e. not perfect, some dramatically so, some less so. How do you think about grappling with the fact that people are morally complex and how we have to deal with that in our memory of them and how we celebrate people or don't in our history?
So where the legacy and the narrative that brought them to, being celebrated in stone somewhere is complicated. I think you can reframe the memorial or the monument with some kind of visual story, plaque, a set of plaques, an audio or video guide that's part of the physical space that says, here are all these great things this person did, but here's some things they did that were not great. I think of this, if you go to Jefferson's home, my brain is really tired, Monticello. If you go there, now, it's a beautiful place. Jefferson was an extraordinary presence in the American democracy in so many ways, but he had slaves, and the slaves helped build it. That story is told now, and some people who visit don't like that fact. I don't think that you can preserve that space as an important part of American national memory without also indicating there in the space how complex the legacy is. I think that's true of a Jefferson. I think that's true of Lincoln. I think it's true of Jonas Salk. I think it's true of many others. I think they're very different than the kind of story you would tell about the Confederacy. Because there's just layer upon layer. They were traitors, right? And it's to me amazing that West Point has barracks named after Robert E. Lee. He was a traitor, the worst kind of thing that you can be for the military. That's a different story. That's a much more uniform story. Lee was a brilliant general in some regards, but the rest of his story, it's unambiguous, where there's more ambiguity in these, I think, in these other stories. I didn't say anything about Christopher Columbus. I'm struggling with that one. I have been for a couple of years. I'm struggling still. So I wouldn't be giving you my best wisdom on that if I tried to weigh in on that particular example now.
Thank you, Dr. Moody Adams. So a question comes in from Chris Livingston, who's the director of our public history, our historical research center here at CSUB. And Chris asks, what advice would you have for our students, some who will be embarking on careers in public history, for changing our national attitude towards memorials and monuments?
Yeah, I think one of the things we need to do is to encourage them to always say, maybe what I was trying to say right at the very end when I pointed out there's some people who try to dismiss the seriousness with which some people take what monuments say. Whether you do any particular thing with a monument after is another question. But when somebody says, oh, that's just political correctness, that, oh, you just are complaining, art and memory and politics are interwoven. The civic art of remembrance that we create and preserves particular understandings of that memory, shapes our identity. It's not a minor issue. And I think the very first thing they should be saying, A, what I am doing is important if the monuments are part of public history. And I can't let myself be turned away by people who say, oh, you just, and even to ask the question about whether the imaginings that are embodied in some work of art, remembrance, needs to be revisited. That question is serious. It's just as serious now as it was in 1776, or during the French Revolution, or in Iraq, when people tear down the statue of Saddam Hussein, or in the former Soviet Union and the countries that were part of the Soviet Union, 89 to 91. It's not a minor issue, and it needs to be discussed the same way a name on a building at a university needs to be discussed, but it needs to be discussed, and you're not being silly or frivolous by saying that that is an important part of our history to be scrutinized.
Great, thank you. I have just a few more questions here. One, Dr. Moody, as you mentioned some memorials or monuments, I can't remember the exact term you were using, in Germany around memories of the Holocaust. And I'm wondering, are there lessons from how Germany as a society has approached that traumatic part of that nation's history and our world's history that we could learn in the US about dealing with some of our traumatic and oppressive history in our country?
That's another really great question. There is a recent book by actually somebody I went to graduate school with named Susan Neiman called Learning from the Germans. And I think the subtitle is something like Race and the Memory of Evil. And her argument in that book is that definitely, she doesn't claim that you just take it over wholesale, but that they've struggled in many ways with a past that's, horrible and evil in a way that's more serious than she sees other countries, especially the US. And she is herself American by birth. I have a slightly more mixed feeling about this. I think some of the things that preceded the efforts that Germany made, but both when it was still divided and then when it, reunified, some of the pressures were external in a way. The US has always been accepted in the global community, even when it's had racial prejudice of the, and still the worst sort. And in fact, I think even in 2020, when there was a moment I thought people were going to say, oh, the US, let's hold them accountable. It ended up being a moment where people in their own countries said, oh yeah, we have the same problem here, rather than let's get America to finally face its problems and we'll hold them accountable internationally when they don't. So the cases are different. People almost assume that racism, that oppression of different groups, including Native peoples, Asian Americans at different points in our history, Latino and Latina Americans, as well as African Americans. It's almost assumed that, well, that's just America. The energy to scrutinize has got to now come from a different place in a different way. It's got to come internally. That lesson may not be something we can take fully from what Germany did. They wanted to be reaccepted into the international community. and Konrad Adenauer from like 1946 to about 1952 or 3, even as he's doing something that's morally, I think, very genuine, he's also saying, look, folks, we will not be readmitted into the global community unless there's no pressure like that here. So some of the lessons may be translatable, transferable, but we may have to just do it all from scratch on our own. I think we do.
Thank you. So we have a final kind of just technical question here, Dr. Moody Adams, comes from Nilsa. And Nilsa asks, what were the 4 R's mentioned toward the beginning of the presentation? I think there was
4 R's.
I was trying to recall that too, and I don't remember.
Oh, it would help me for you to remind me what was I talking roughly about?
Listen, recalibrate, reconstruct, reform. But I didn't.
Oh, it's not written down. It just came out of my head. I think what I was trying to suggest was you can say reframe, but that doesn't tell you all that you're doing. You're trying to recontextualize. You're trying to, I think I might have even used the kind of slangy term repurpose, but I don't like that one very much, so I won't stick with it. But I know recontextualize, reframe, rethink, reshape. That might be the R's that I was using, but I didn't mean any of them in a technical sense. That the question I really appreciate, but if I gave the impression they were technical, I didn't mean to.
Nilsa also asks, what was the name of the book on falsified Civil War history that you mentioned?
The book that gives the false history, or the book that talks about it being false?
I think, why don't you list both if you can remember them, just in
case. So the lost cause narrative is Edward, let me make sure I get his name right. My brain's a little tired here. It's Edward Pollard. I had another name of a different Edward in my head. Edward Pollard, The Lost Cause, and it comes out in 1866. It's reprinted. It's just full of, to my mind, I don't actually like to recommend it to people. I find it very hard to read. One of the best criticisms is by the historian David Blight, Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American History. That's a book I recommend. David Blight, to my mind, is about as subtle an interpreter of American history as you'll find.
Thank you, Dr. Moody Adams, so much. And thank you for being so gracious with your time. I know it's late for you out there. It's 10 p.m. on the East Coast, but it's been a fascinating discussion and great questions. And we thank our audience for engaging tonight with us too. I wanted to note next Thursday, March 18th, we will have another colloquia, 6 p.m. with Max Kinner, who's founder and executive director of the Bard Prison Initiative, one of the most well-established college and prison programs in the country. So please join us for that. But for now, again, Dr. Moody Adams, thanks so much. We really appreciate
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to be part of this series. I really appreciate the questions as well. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Take care. Take care, everyone. Be safe. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye now.